The Refugee Center, which he co-directs, received the 2002 Outstanding Achievement Award for Political Asylum, Immigration, Representation Project, and for sensitivity and dedication in caring for the health and human rights of refugees and survivors of torture. He is a member of the Global Implementation Project of the Istanbul Protocol Manual on the Effective Investigation and Documentation of Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and an advisor to UNESCO. During her tenure as artistic director of the Underground Railway Theater, URT, Deborah Wise has helped to create over 30 new works as a playwright, director, and/or dramaturge. She's performed with other companies in Boston and New York City, including the Public Theater in Julie Taymor's Haggadah, and has received a Boston Globe citation for Best Solo Performance. Wise is also the artistic co-director of Catalyst Collaborative at MIT, a unique science theater partnership between MIT and Underground Railway Theater, which has presented premieres and newly commissioned work in Cambridge, in New York City, and in Washington, D.C. Wise is on the faculty of Project Zero Summer Institute at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, led in a theater and active citizenship residency at Tufts University, and helped launch a new course at MIT, Making Theater About Science. Our final panel member, Eula Kisus, whom we hope will be joining us, she may be delayed because of the weather, leads the Carr Center's Initiative in Theater and Human Rights. She conceives drama as a socially conscious reflection pervading multiple aspects of society and culture. She received a PhD in ethics and aesthetics under the mentorship of Elie Wiesel and has collaborated with artists such as John Malkovich, James Taylor, Marissa Berenson, and Theodore Bickel. In 2010, Kisus partnered with the United Nations on the theme Theater and Human Rights and was awarded the Order of Arts and Letters from the French Minister of Culture. In 2011, UNESCO named her as an Artist for Peace, giving her the opportunity to collaborate directly with Francophone countries spanning 3 different continents on the Mediterranean Project. So I'd like to thank our panelists very much for being here tonight. They have a few words to say about creativity and stress. And let's begin with Dr. Groden.
Thank you for the invitation to share a few thoughts with you. I'm actually going to focus a little bit on the history as a Holocaust scholar of Brundibar and on the play, the reading that we just heard, and then talk a little about resiliency. Brundibar, which is what the play, that the manuscript they talk about in the section that was just put on, which is Czech for Bumblebee, was a small opera written for children, and it was composed by Hans Krese and lyrics by Adolf Hofmeister in 1938. And this was actually a child's opera that was put together as an entry in a child's opera competition. So this was before anybody they were deported to Theresienstadt. It premiered in German-occupied Prague at the Jewish orphanage, so that comes right from the, and the Jews were then transported to Theresienstadt in 1942. In July of 1942, the score of Brundibar was smuggled into the camp and reorchestrated, and its first performance took place on September 23, 1943, in the barracks in Theresienstadt. This was, I'll tell you a little bit about Theresienstadt, but this was a model camp, quote unquote, kind of a mix between a concentration camp and a ghetto. And the Nazis recognized the propaganda value of the staging of this opera. And so they actually filmed it and used it as a propaganda to show that things were not so bad in the camps. The same production was performed for the inspection of Theresienstadt by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which came to inspect Theresienstadt in September of 1944, and that was the last of 55 performances of Brundibar. 2 weeks later, after that final performance, the artists were transferred to Auschwitz, and most were killed. It's a story about the weak and oppressed, and we can talk about the psychodynamics of why this is so speaks to the people in Theresienstadt. But the actual Brundibar is about 2 children who have a sick mother, and doctors prescribe milk for the mother's health, and the children seek milk in the town but have no money to purchase it, so the children try to sing to obtain the money, and they observe the organ grinder Brundibar. And Brundibar chases them away, and then 3 animals come and recruit other children, and they drown out Brundibar, and ultimately the townspeople are moved to give money to the children, and the opera concludes with a victory march about defeating the evil Brundibar. So, but the giraffe is really, uses the facts from the opera, which was that the opera was smuggled into Theresienstadt, to talk about this situation of the beloved toy giraffe and the suitcase, and leaving the girl with this difficult decision. So it's really a morality tale about a young girl learning important things, that's what really captures people in its production. Now, Theresienstadt existed for 3.5 years between November of 41 to May of 1945. It served as a transit camp for Czech Jews being deported to the killing centers, concentration camps, and forced labor in German-occupied Poland. So it was this funny ghetto labor camp, but it served as a holding area, and it served as important propaganda for the Germans. 15,000 children passed through Terezin. Remember that 2 out of every 3 Jews of Eastern Europe was killed during the Holocaust. 1 out of every 3 Jews in the world were killed during the Holocaust. But their children were separated from their parents and often in what are called children's barracks. I've spent a lot of time with a survivor, or with many survivors. I'm to care for a number of survivors from Theresienstadt, including children. Most of the survivors today were children during the Holocaust. And so there's a particular man who lives here in Boston, actually, named Misha Kraus, who I spent a lot of time with. And he and his children in a barrack wrote a magazine called Kamerad, which was like a comic book. And this is another example of trying to maintain normality and play, and how important play was, and rehearsing. And so these boys got together and made this magazine. They put out like 16 editions, and they talk about the Wild West, and they talk about cars, and it's really a way to cope, a way to play out. 90% of the children died who were sent to the killing camps, and 1.5 million children ultimately died during the Holocaust. I just want to make a couple other few words, and then we'll open it up to the next speaker. And that's about resiliency, which is really this part I know most about as dealing with patients, trying to focus on resiliency rather than pathology. We spend all too much time focusing on the pathology of patients and not enough on the resiliency. Resiliency is a tendency to cope with stress and adversity. It's most commonly understood as a dynamic process and not a personality trait, but there are several factors which tend to promote resiliency that I see in my work. Children are more vulnerable, but also more resilient. They're vulnerable because of their age and because of their inability to comprehend, depending on the age in which they are found during the Holocaust, but also they have a lot of malleability. But people who tend to be resilient, including children, tend to be those who cope with stress, and we'll talk about creativity and stress. They tend to be good problem solvers. They tend to be able to seek help, and they hold on to the belief that there's something one can do to manage one's feelings and cope, often called an internal locus of control. They have the ability to think that everything is not happening to them, but they actually can control certain things. They generally have social supports, and that's what the boys did in the camps together. They're connected with others, and many of these children, their parents were in the camp in Theresienstadt as well, but they were not in the same, there was a family lager, but then they were often separated, but they would still see their parents. They also see themselves as survivors after the war, or even thrivers, as opposed to victims. but they can find some positive meaning in the trauma, which is Viktor Frankl and his work. Forgetting is an anesthetic was one of the lines from the play, which of course is just the opposite of what we try to do. You can't forget. Memory can't be, and you try to forget, you block out and you numb yourself. And so what we try to do in caring for contemporary survivors is to get them remember without reliving, to remember without reliving. But there's a complex relationship between creativity and stress, and I'll leave that to the experts. But obviously, some stress can be helpful in terms of creativity and being able to cope, but obviously overwhelming stress is detrimental and causes you not ability to make creative play or other creations. So let me stop there, and we'll open it hear the next speaker, and then we can have some conversation. Hopefully that gives you some sense of the history.
Thank you, Dr. Groden. Deborah, we'll hear from you now. Would you like to stay in your seat, or do you want to come over here? Okay, very good. I was wondering if we could move the microphone so that I can sit down too.
Great. Well, one of the reasons I'm so delighted to be part of this conversation with all of you is that our company, Underground Railway Theatre, is planning to produce Tony Kushner's translation of Brundarbar and his play that he wrote to give it historical context, But the Giraffe, in 2013. And so we're really eager to think deeply about why do this play now? What connections could it have for us now? And you probably have heard, if you've heard about Brundarbar at all, that some of the survivors, the few survivors of those children who performed it, do speak about their experience. Most famously, Ella Weisberger talks about her experience playing the cat in the children's opera, and she does talk about how it helped the children, at least for the time that they were, as you point out, Michael, rehearsing, performing, help them forget, transform their experience. And it's so impossible for me to actually imagine what it must have been like for those children. Tony Kushner asked himself when he was thinking about doing this project, in a pitiless world, how is one to speak to the young? How much is one to tell a child of the injustices and dangers he or she will confront, perhaps have to confront, long before adulthood? And I'm not certain what the answer to that question is, but I do intuit how essential it is to find and nurture one's authentic voice, and certainly that the role of art must be very powerful to help structure the chaos of life and to resist oppression, and that certainly comes out clearly if you look at the poetry that comes out of Terezin. I was reading it today, and it seemed like each poem demonstrated one possible way in which the arts can help deal with a trauma and oppression. I'd just like to share a few with you. For instance, the need to find the inspiration to resist. Mind you, these are all poems written by children who were at Theresienstadt. On a sunny evening, the sun has made a veil of gold so lovely that my body aches. Above the heavens shriek with blue, convinced I've smiled by some mistake. I want to fly, but where, how high? If in barbed wire things can bloom, why couldn't I? I will not die. This is one that I thought was particularly beautiful. And it seems like the poet is trying to find a way to locate the spirit inside, a spirit that can't be erased through any kind of objectification like must have, of course, happened at that camp. But this is an excerpt, a poetic picture of a pianist who was a prisoner at the camp. Under the closed eyes, another person sits, Under the closed eyes, he seeks among the keys as among the veins through which the blood flows softly. When you kiss them with a knife and put a song to it. This man yesterday cut all the veins, opening all the organ stops, paid all the birds to sing, even though the harsh fingers of the sexton sleep heavy upon us, bent in his manner of death. You are like Beethoven. Your forehead was as heavy as the heavens before it rains. And the need to transform one's reality. A bit of a poem. Listen. The boat whistle has sounded now, and we must sail out toward an unknown port. We'll sail a long, long way, and dreams will turn to truth. And the last one I wanted to share is the call for collective resistance, and it feels like it's a central theme of Brundibar. I'd like to go away, alone, where there are other, nicer people, somewhere into the far unknown. There where no one kills another, maybe more of us, 1,000 strong, will reach this goal before too long. So, doing the kind of work we do in the theater, and anyone I think who thinks about art at all, you can think of so many powerful examples of creativity being fueled by the need, such a need. The African American spiritual, for instance, I know that songs like Go Down Moses were forbidden. We know the ANC anthem was forbidden in South Africa for a long time. I think that the wearing of the green was it's clear that artistic expression is powerful, if for no other reason than to give a stronger identity to the oppressed. We hosted at our theater 3 years ago the Al Rod Cultural Theater Society from the Aida refugee camp in Bethlehem. And the director of that program, Abed Aboswar, speaks of art as an act of beautiful resistance against, in that case, the ugliness of the experience of Palestinian young people living in these camps. So we hope that with our production of Brundibar, not only to share a beautiful folk opera with a remarkable stage history, which people should know about, but also to make connections with other historical moments in which art has emerged to resist oppression. That's all I wanted to share. Sure.
Oops, have I got some? Here we go. Thank you. You are joining us here at the Cambridge Forum, where we're discussing creativity and stress with Dr. Michael Groden and Deborah Wise. I'm Shelley Carson. In just a few moments, we'll be opening the forum up to questions from the audience, but as the moderator, I get to ask a couple of questions first. Let me begin by asking you a question, Deborah. You mentioned that the role of art can help structure the chaos of life. That was something that you mentioned. Both psychoanalyst Aaron Esmond and composer Stephen Sondheim have defined art and creativity as the attempt to mold a sense of order out of chaos. In general, do you see creative work during extreme stress as an artist's way of finding meaning in seemingly unfathomable situations?
Yes. And I'm trying to come up with other examples. I mean, I feel, now just speaking as an artist,
Absolutely.
I feel that the reason to create art is to share. Well, it's a protection against death. I mean, ultimately, it's a way of taking the stresses of life, however they're experienced, and making a way of creating, remembering the beauty that we're surrounded by, and taking that beauty and crystallizing it and sharing it, saying, look at this, don't forget. Right? I think as an actor, which is what I essentially am, I feel that I sometimes feel that I know I have made more sense out of my life since I've been able to have the experience of portraying many, many people and going through the pain that they experience, and then I have epiphanies about my own experience. I'm sure that people here can speak to this as well, but it's one of the reasons I think it's so sad that there aren't more avocational artists now. And I feel my father would often talk about how when he was a boy and went to his uncle's farm, how everybody, no matter how tired they were, could play an instrument or declaimed a poem or something at the end of the day. And it seems like the opportunity to make art is something that we all require to be part of a human community and to make sense of what's nonsensical.
Right. I often, when I'm talking about the meaning of creativity or the purpose of art, suggests that creativity and art are our long-distance communication mechanism. It's a way that we can communicate with each other across centuries, across continents, and even across ideologies, to share something of what it means to be human, to share the human experience. And I certainly think that the Brundabar play is doing just that. It's talking to us, not quite across centuries, but definitely across decades, to share something about this human experience. Dr. Grodin, would you like to make a comment about the order out of chaos?
Yeah, I would just remind you people that children had a unique experience during the Holocaust. Most of them did not end up in camps. If you ended up in a camp, in the classic camp, they were selected and killed. And so most of the children who survived were hidden either in people's homes or in convents or what have you. And what happened was that in the patients that I see over and over again, I hear the story of a 13-year-old who's told by his parents who are being taken off to the camps that now it's your job to care for your 3 siblings. And not only that, but they were put in a home where they were Jewish children put in a Catholic or Christian home and had to lead a different life. And so they were parentified, and they lost their childhood in many ways. And so play for them is a way to fantasize and a way to gain back some of that childhood, interchange. And so play is a very, very important part of all children's lives, but particularly for the children during the Holocaust. It was very, very important for them to have imagination and be able to regularize. The other thing is even before, particularly the Czech children, before they were sent to Theresienstadt, the school was closed down, and so all Jewish schools were closed, so they couldn't go to their normal place where they would congregate and interact with other children. And so they developed their own fantasy world, and so far as they could meet with other children, they would, but oftentimes they were kept at home and because it was unsafe. And so they developed a strong fantasy world with books and characters and play and all kinds of things.
I'm reminded of another poem from Terezin. This child says, home, home, why did they tear me away? Here the weak die easy as a feather, and when they die forever. And then the poem goes on and closes with, yet we all hope the time will come when we'll go home again. And I know how dear it is, and often I remember it. And reading this poem, I was reminded that a poet doesn't die forever. You create a work of art, you don't die forever. Even if it's something ephemeral like theater, I often think about that, because you do it, then it's over. But I think that's part of the creating of sense out of chaos. It's remembering that it's not all absurdity. Reading about how the children, when they sang the lullaby in Brundabar, the people who were in charge of the camp took off their hats and sat down as if they were honoring the children that they were then going to send off the next day. So how does a human being do that? You know, that's crazy. That's insane. So the making of art is of course not just a way of escaping. It's a way of controlling life. You know, bringing it back, saying no, that's not life. That's not what humanity is. Humanity is this other thing. Does that make sense?
It does make
Yeah.
sense, and I think that's beautiful too. A way of controlling your reality. Can you speak to that a little bit with your patients that you have seen over the years?
Well, the stories that the children have often tend to be expansive. You know, the boys that wrote this magazine wrote stories about the Wild Wild West. Now, they, of course, never experienced the Wild Wild West, but they must have read, and they captured their imagination, the frontier, and so they write about that. And they write about things that are their fantasy of what it must be outside of the camp. What it would be like to be free, what it would be like to be expansive. So you can find all kinds of references to their attempt to escape, if you will, from their situation through the stories, through the fantasies. And I find this very, very true. But the problem is the children who survived, many of them, of course, had no parents after they were rescued, and then the ones that were in in homes where they were hid, there was a problem with the parents who came back. How the children explained that they were like given up, and the kind of who do they see as their parents, and all kinds of conflict about who cared for them, why their parents left them, and who are their parents. So there's an enormous amount of ambivalence and concern about that safety. So.
And were they able to address that creatively?
Well,
through
it's not.
creativity?
Yeah, it depends. You know, each person obviously has their own way of coping. But those who tend to use art, tend to use stories, tend to do better, in my view, at least in my experience, than those who, again, try to forget, try not to grapple with, deal with, engage in, talk about. There was a conspiracy of silence right after the war, where people didn't talk, people didn't want to listen, and that lasted for a long time. And so people were kind of denied their existence. Remember, there weren't photographs because people couldn't, they were taken, confiscated. And so the reality of who the people were in their lives are often not there. They don't have a grave site, they don't have a time of death. And so they have delayed mourning, prolonged mourning, and grieving, which is quite deep. And so it's a matter of trying to recapture that for them, or to play through, to work through.
To work through. And speaking of working through, some of you may be familiar with the work of James Pennebaker out of the University of Texas, and he's done a lot of research on expressive writing and how this can help people to cope with, especially with traumatic stress, if they've had an issue with a trauma in their lifetime. And basically what he's found is that very short periods of expressive writing where you just sit for 20 or 30 minutes a day, even for as little as 3 days in a row, can really reduce stress and help people to actually make meaning out of things that have happened in their lives. Now, other types of expressive creativity, for instance, theater and dance and art, can have the same effect. But it's really amazing at how little expression it takes to help you to begin to work through some of these serious traumatic memories. Oh, our other guest has arrived. Oh, hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you so much. My plane also was delayed.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, thank you for joining us. We've talked for a few moments. Each of us has talked a little bit about creativity and stress, and I wondered if you'd like to make a few comments. Eula, is that correct, the pronunciation, about this topic?
Yes, definitely. Well, creativity and stress, how can I go just did. I couldn't have done better. Concerning my work, when you're dealing with, topics concerning human rights, my work is theater and human rights. I'm a UNESCO Artist for Peace. And when you have to deal with survivors, with victims, when you have to deal with people who suffered, and you never suffered the way they suffered, and you're not pretending one day suffering where they suffered, and you have to transmit it artistically. I think, of course, the level of stress is pretty much very, very important. And the way you can transform this into something creative is by, I think, focusing first on the idea of transmission, but very objectively, in order for the audience to become the witness of the witness. And I have been working now with the Shoah, I've been working with Armenia, I was working also in Rwanda. So I have been really moved by those different topics, and I was always try to remain very aligned, I would say, with the people that I had to defend. So concerning stress and creativity, I would say trying to always think that you're not doing anything for yourself, but you're doing it for others, and that's the only way for you to basically transmit and to calm yourself down in order to be very focused on what you're doing.
Thank you. That brings me to a kind of an interesting thought about the neuroscience of creativity and the neuroscience of stress. These are two altered states of consciousness, shall we say, that are actually diametrically opposed. The neuroscience of the stress reaction or the stress response, for instance, suggests that the brain is flooded with the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, and norepinephrine starts a chain reaction which causes the attention to be very narrowly focused. It causes high levels of anxiety, and it causes the body to release hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. On the other hand, a state which we'll call the creative state, recent research has indicated that it is characterized by low levels of this brain chemical norepinephrine. It's also characterized by diffused or defocused attentional focus, lowering levels of anxiety, increasing the feelings of well-being, and reducing cardiovascular activity. So the two states seem almost opposite. And one of the questions that I have for you all, which Eula has given us at least one answer to, is can these two states coexist? And if they don't, how can you change from a state of high stress to a state of creativity? And one of the things you just said to us is that you think along the lines of transmitting, that you are giving something not for yourself, but for other people. And I was wondering, Deborah, if you would like to comment on how you must have had instances in your life where certainly performing is very stressful. How do you transform that stress into a state of creativity?
Well, I think actually it relates to what you were saying, because whenever I feel confused and I'm off stage before I go on, and I feel like I'm not up to the task, I think of serving the character. That the character, even though its character is somehow bigger than myself and deserves respect and is real, you know. So you're serving the character, you're serving the play, you're serving the story, you're serving the audience. So actually this transmission, this active transmission you're talking about seems so important. And I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking about about Abousor's term, beautiful resistance, and thinking about what he was inviting the youth he works with, these Palestinian youth, to use as an inspiration. the creation of beauty, to take a terrible situation and create beauty in the face of it is also an act of transmission. Because it doesn't make any sense if you're just doing it for yourself. You're creating it and you're putting it in front of you and you and you to also witness and accept. So yeah, that seems to be really key, a key position.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very good. Dr. Grodin, when, for instance, your patients or the children that you worked with that created the comic books, was there an element of how do you feel that they were able to go from that stressful place to that creative place?
Well, it was a matter of trying to deal with boredom, but also trying to deal with the situation in which they find themselves in. What comes to mind when I think about this notion of creativity is that the first thing that one needs to have is safety for all parties before one can deal with anything. And so for these children and for the survivors, the first issue is food, shelter, being safe, being free from illness. And so that takes precedent over anything else. So first of all, dealing with these things in a war-torn area, which is a lot of the patients that I see are survivors from war-torn areas, you have to get them out of that environment in order to really start to deal with the issues. But the amazing resiliency is what people try to do and to maintain their life while they have incredible resiliency. But remember, the patients that we see are the ones that were survived, and the patients that were able to escape and able to get here. So they have a certain resiliency that's special onto them. But I think one of the main things I would say is, generalization is a very dangerous thing. That each person's story is unique and special.
Definitely.
Each person had their history before they were in the Shoah or in whatever it was. They may have had their own family traumas, and we can't forget what happened before, during, and after. And so that we have to take each patient and listen to them. In my experience, I've learned more from listening than I think I've provided to many of the patients. Listening to them, listening very careful, and trying to understand and trying to accept them for what they did and what they were able to do.
You mentioned a few moments ago that children are more vulnerable, but they're also more resilient.
Yep.
Are there ways that you can think of that in the present day that those of you who are parents or teachers out there can enhance the resilience of children through creative work or creative activity that would allow them to keep that resilience as they grow older? Dr. Grodin, we'll start with you.
Well, I'll leave it to the psychologist to respond first. You obviously have experience with this.
How about the rest of the panel members? Eula, do you have any comments about that?
Well, personally, I don't have children, so I would be very... I worked with children. I work with children 5, 6, 7 years old. But the more I'm thinking about it, the more I realize that pure creativity, I think, comes from a mistake.
Comes from?
From a mistake. Something that suddenly forced to have the entire equilibrium dysfunction come from a certain disbalance of what we think is beauty, and suddenly it's not beautiful, but it's creative. We go like a good recipe. Suddenly we found the best recipe because the person forgot an element. And I think that with the children, the stress sometimes is not coming from the children themselves because they are not used to any type of equilibrium. They are not used to any type of balance. They are in search always to something that looks regular. They are always shaping themselves day after day. And I would say that there are a lot of creativity just by watching at them. I know that I've been working with, I was telling you, children 5 to 7 years old, and they came up with ideas. I was working in transmitting, the Shoah, so they were part of this very big performance I was doing. And And they brought to me so much, asking questions sometimes so simple and so bothering that sometimes they go back to the before stress. Actually, I think someone who doesn't have a full conscious cannot stress, really. It's only when the kid has the notion of conscious that he needs to fit and he doesn't find his place that suddenly, I think, the stress appears. So I would say that we need to learn a lot from children, from little childhood, and we need also to be like them, be ready to absorb our mistake and see them as possible creativity. Of course, we have to make something out of the mistake itself and recognizing it as creativity. It's like surrealism, but I think we have to make this distance and observe children. We have a lot to learn from them.
I think that it's important to learn that it's pleasurable to express your voice, and that's something you can give a child, and then they can carry that forward. And I am not a scientist, so I can't base this on any data. But I think in my own experience working with children and thinking about my own children, that makes sense to me. But actually, what was most vivid in my mind just now, we're working with a wonderful composer right now on a project. His name is Todd Mackover, and maybe some of you know his work. He's at MIT. But one of the many things that he does is he helps through technology people, for instance, he's worked with a man who's not so young now, but he was a very young man when he started working with him, who has cerebral palsy, to find his voice as a composer. And now this fellow who cannot communicate to you in speaking, you meet him and you feel like he is incapable of communication. And he composes these beautiful pieces and speaks to us this way. He could not do that if he wasn't helped to find a way to express his voice, And I think then once you have it, you're hungry for it. Once you experience that, and so it's a certain empowering, I think.
So one of the ways that we can help children is by teaching them that this is a positive and
it's pleasurable
yeah. thing to express yourself.
And respecting their own expression, their individual expression, their own dignity. And one of the big mistakes people make is to tell adults as well as children how they should feel or how they should react. People need to react the way they react, and we need to listen and try to grapple with that.
I agree. So that we need to accept other people's feelings and expression rather than judging them and telling them what to do with them.
Yeah, definitely. And if I can just ask, I think we really need to think that children can help us more than we can help them. Because fortunately, like when a child is not already formatted, he has so much to show us before we come and just mold it into what he has to fit into the society. I think we have to have this time where we can absorb a lot of things and maybe just take a little time before just forcing him to fit,
One of the other interesting things that neuroscientists have found is that being in a non-judgmental state of mind is a prerequisite to having creative insights. So when you have those aha moments, if you are in a state of quiet contemplation, reflection, or absorption, non-judgmental state, this is when insights most often come. One other thing I wanted to just comment on that Yulia said is that sometimes children, when they make mistakes, and the way they handle them is something that we should look at. When I actually teach a course called Creativity, Madmen, Geniuses, and Harvard Students. And I always ask students at the beginning of the course to write down a definition of creativity. And one of my favorites that a student has given to me is this: creativity is capitalizing on failure. What's interesting is that highly creative people and children both know that failure is part of the creative process. You can't succeed creatively until you've failed over and over again, just like a child learning to walk, a child learning to fit in, a child learning any of their schoolwork. So creativity is, in fact, capitalizing on failure. Well, I don't want to monopolize all of the question time. For those of you who are listening on the radio, this is the Cambridge Forum, and we're discussing creativity and stress with Dr. Michael Grodin, who is with the Boston University School of Public Health, Deborah Wise, who's the artistic director of the Underground Railway Theater, and Eula Gessus of the Carr Center for Human Rights. At this time, I would like to ask if there are any questions from the audience, and if you would like to ask a question of our panelists, please come forward to the microphone, and we'll continue the discussion.
Well, it certainly didn't save them. 90% of them were killed, were sent to Auschwitz and were killed.
No, I know. But what I mean is, do you think that in performing, and their parents seeing this and so on, that they may have thought that it might have saved them? Obviously, it didn't. But could that have generated some kind of survival hope, even though it would have been a false hope in the aftermath?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the interaction, the camaraderie, the ability to produce and put on something, to accomplish something, I think was very, very powerful. And that's, in talking to the survivors, that's what I hear.
You mean they actually said that somehow they were more hopeful because of their performance?
Certainly they were able to cope better with what their situation was.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another interesting problem, in a sense, that art can create hope, but on the other hand, it may also be creating a kind of false hope. Of course, that's only known after the fact.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think part of when we talk about creativity, part of what we have to embrace or invite into being is paradox and contradiction. It makes sense to me that that's part of the creative process. So feeling more alive until the moment that you perish seems to be part of what we're talking about.
That's really an interesting point. Alan Rothensberg from the Harvard Medical School has written some about this feeling of paradox and creativity. He calls it Janusian thinking. So Janus was the Roman god of the past and the future, up and down, backward and forward, and the ability to keep in mind two opposing, contradictory concepts sort of superimposed on top of each other seems to be a real skill and part of the creative process.
I'd like to ask you all to talk a little bit about something Dr. Grodin mentioned when he talked about resiliency and the ability to cope and be creative. He said one of the characteristics of this trait is the ability to solve problems, problem solving. And I wish you would all talk a little bit more about the creativity involved in problem solving and the way those two activities seem to work back and forth. If you are creative, you solve a problem, and if you're good at solving problems, you're creative.
Eula, would you like to begin?
Okay, well, I would say, I like when you were saying that capitalizing on failures, the definition of creativity, but I would say that it's not only capitalizing on failures, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it well. I think it's also the failure itself. And I think when you're saying about finding a solution by being creative, I think it's you have a problem and you're going to treat creatively. So for me, the way I understand creativity, it's not by finding solutions, it's really by the way you will raise the question. For my problematic, when you have to deal with like human rights topics in performances, you're not trying to find a way to answer the conflict, you're just trying to present the conflict in a different way, using theater as a media. Same thing with the Shoah, there are least and least, survivors. So, and we had many ways to deal with the Shoah, movies and books. And so theater has a different way to express this by having survivors on stage and then second generation and then third generation coming here, some performing, some being just on stage to confirm that happened. So I would say that the failure we shouldn't be so mean against the failure. I think failure should be not only absorbed and canceled, but can be handled in an artistic way. And we could be very creative thanks to the failure. So not trying to overcome it, but to accept it and to use it and present it in a way could be creative.
The resilient patients that I see and experience often don't see it as failure. Failure has a negative connotation. They see it as obviously not being successful in whatever they plan, but as even an opportunity, as a way to say, what can I learn from this? What can I take away from this that can help me? In fact, those that are really, I care for a number of Tibetan monks who are imprisoned and tortured in Tibet on a daily basis. And they say that they actually almost thank their perpetrators for giving them the opportunity to learn about themselves and learn about how to be compassionate. It's like a remarkable thought.
It's a creative way of looking at it.
Yeah. So it depends on how you frame the issue and how you frame the problem.
And I really think that truly is part of the creative psyche, to be able to look at a situation, a negative situation, and find multiple, not just one, but maybe multiple perspectives of viewing it, and being able to choose then which perspective you take at any given moment.
And talking about perspective taking, I think, is important, because that's a key move, I think, for all kinds of art making. If when we're talking about creativity, we're talking about art. The disposition to take different perspectives or points of view is what the painter does, the writer does, the actor does, the musician does. I mean, you can't create without that, and that can be so liberating, I would imagine. In trying to think about stressful situations, that immediately gives you several doors.
Yes, wonderful. Yula, you must deal with people do you deal with people who are in current crisis, who are currently in terribly stressful situations, or most of the time have they found a way to safety and are now trying to find a way to deal with what they've been through?
I have done multiple work as doing psychodrama, so drama therapy, and I've been working a lot with beaten women, for example, with women's rights. I've done also with problems with children, for example. So here, in fact, we are using theater like a box that allows you to rehearse your life, to give you a chance in a situation to stop the situation in the middle and try to find another way to behave, trying to find another way to answer the violence. And we see that it's very creative, because suddenly, whatever happened in life, which is a sort of a continuity where you don't have a word to say with the way an event comes after an event, like a pearl comes after a pearl, so you don't have a way to stop the necklace. Suddenly the theater can say, okay, we stop the scene. Now take the scene from the very beginning, stop whenever you want, and try to express yourself. And we're having very good results. Women who dare talking, at last about what happened. Men who are involved who suddenly couldn't see the perspective but understand some concept because it's performed by someone else. So the stress suddenly, I think, is also almost canceled because it's released, it's analyzed, it has time to suddenly being unshaped slowly. And when you get to the point where the onion is totally naked and you have this original point where suddenly you see that the person wants to be loved, you got up to a point where everybody agree and there is no stress anymore because you suddenly see the failure that is inside of each human being. And this is very moving. I know that you're using, I'm sure, the same technique that I'm using with the theater of the Brazilian playwright.
You mean Boal?
Boal, yes, you're using the same technique than me. So, yeah, this is the type of work that I'm doing too.
She persisted. I said, oh, sure, right. On top of everything else, we're going to do this project, which has no funding. And I found the next morning something under my door from her saying, no, we really must make this. And she herself had lost several jobs, and she's really terrific, very capable person. And, life just was not, it seemed like we needed role models we didn't have. So we decided to interview women of all stripes. They could be in despair, but only partial despair. They couldn't be in complete despair. But the whole activity, the project took us 3 years to create, and it absolutely shifted my perspective about so many things. And we interviewed women who were homeless, who were just dealing with all kinds of stresses in their lives, and crafted this piece. And I was so glad to hear you laugh when I mentioned the title of the play. I just want to end this bit by saying that we kept that title, Washed Up Middle-Aged Women, and we had put posters up for when we did a performance of it at Somerville Theater. And at 9 o'clock one morning in the theater, right when the workday started, I got a call from a woman who said, okay, I saw your poster. It's not funny. I offered this woman free tickets. I said, look, it's really, you'll like, no, it's not funny, click. So she was not open to the possibility this could reduce her stress.
Do you have an anecdote?
Well, with the type of theater that I'm doing, I would say when you have to deal with something that is very far from who you are, and maybe not that far, when you have to deal with suffering, and which is what a burden, the only stress you can have is to not be objective enough to transmit, the testimony. You're always stressed because you don't know. So I had a lot of people who come and try to calm down and try to be really, very close to reality. No, I won't say that my performing, like the way I'm doing performing art has been helpful. Just maybe one stressful situation that I had to deal with that can be a little interesting was when I worked with, the first time I had to work with John Malkovich was like 4 years ago, and I sent the play I wrote to John Malkovich's agent. And John Malkovich's agent called me and said, believe me or not, he likes your play, he's going to call you. And that was, of course, me. I'm a nothing, How do you want Mr. Malkovich call me? And my mom called me at that time. And I was telling my mom, she's calling me from France, obviously. I said to her, Mom, someone very important might call, so if I have to switch phone. And then at that moment, I see a double call. So I take the phone, and then there was a Chopin music and a very sensual voice saying, I am John Malkovich, And I'm like, well, Mr. Malkovich, can you hold on a sec? And then I switched the line and I said, Mom, it's John Malkovich, I call you back. And then I hear, hello. I forgot to switch the phone. So it was extremely stressful, but at the same time, very funny. And it helped me a lot because it set him in a very good mood and we became friends. So that's the only time where stress was a good thing for me. But otherwise, I don't see any situation I had to that was useful for me.
It's a great story. Do you have an anecdote about stress and creativity that you'd like to share, Dr. Grodin?
I think not.
Okay. Okay. Well, one of the things, we'll be wrapping up in just a few moments, but one of the things that I would just like to point out to everybody who's here and who's watching and who is listening is that creativity really, there is some empirical evidence that suggests that it does in fact reduce stress. I talked just a moment ago about some of the neurological differences between stress and creativity. And obviously, if you think about getting into a creative state, which you can do through participating in creative activity, it actually does change brain chemistry. So this is one thing to remember. Gene Cohen did a study several years ago. It was actually published in 2006. The study began in 2002 of older people, senior citizens, who were participating in creative activities. And what he found is that compared to a control group who did not participate in creative activities, and again, the problems that come with aging are a different type of stress than we've been talking about today, but those senior citizens who participated in creative activities for 2 years, for short periods of time each week for 2 years, had fewer doctor visits, they were able to reduce their medications, they reported greater well-being and satisfaction with life. And so these were very real health, mental and physical health benefits of participating in creative activity. We know that all of us have the ability to be creative, and very often when we're under stress or we're in severely stressful situations, we forget that creativity is one of those skills, one of those capabilities we have as humans that can help us in a stressful situation. So I'd like to ask one final question of our panel. Before I do, are there any other questions from the audience? If you would come forward to the microphone, that would be great.
Let's see, hello, thank you very much, all of you. If I can put this question in some order. First of all, what comes to mind is that that expression you have in creating, how do you create calm out of chaos? Just that expression alone sounds to me like it came from the experts that are trying to figure out the beautiful people that do creativeness. Because I think there's always been that gap between the experts and the creative artistic people of expression, and the people that you just spoke about, the seniors, whether it's seniors or children, whatever group of people they are, that do creative things, do have a tendency to become much more expressive in the things concerning their lives. And that's why I think there is a lot of division between the experts who are trying to figure out the other people, because there's a lot of control in there. There always has been. Because if it wasn't that situation, our schools would exhibit that, more creativity for children instead of giving them drugs for DSS and all the other labels they put on the children. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I would just like clarification a little bit from the panel.
Can you move just a little bit closer to the microphone?
Okay.
Thank you.
I would just like a little bit of clarification. I noted that you started off your program with somewhat of a play. Did you, in your process of this presentation today, did you select that play first to support your delivery here, or what you were going to float? Or did you decide what you were going to float here and then connected it with that play? What came first? And is that question, maybe I'm not asking the question clearly.
Well, our host, Cambridge Forum, had selected the panelists, and that included the play was part of the idea. So one of the ways to, what is being referred to is segments from But the Giraffe by Tony Kushner, which is related to Brundabar, an opera that Dr. Grodin talked about. So it was because of the history with terrorism. That's why it was selected.
Okay,
But I wonder what's underneath your question. I'm curious.
I just wanted to know how were they. Maybe I was missing something in connecting the dots and why this was presented and then your conversation over here. The other question was, as a part of it, why was the animal the giraffe? Did I miss that too? The giraffe is a part of the play?
Our radio audience, unfortunately, didn't get an opportunity to hear this play excerpt. So I'm just going to say briefly that this play is about the smuggling of the score for Brundabar into the concentration camp, into the camp,
Okay.
terrorism.
All right.
And I think it's brilliant on Kushner's part to make this. Since it's an introduction to a children's opera,
Yes.
so with this choice that this girl has to make, where she wants to take, she doesn't.
Yes.
This, I think, must have been so stressful. The children didn't know what was going on
Yes.
when they were being herded off
Yes.
with their families, and what we talked about when we were talking about this reading was how did the grandparents and the parents talk to their children about this? How could they possibly? So the child knows that something is
Yes.
up, right?
Yes.
This is a terrible thing. We're all going away. Everybody's acting as though everything is going to be all right, but it can't be all right if we're only allowed one suitcase each.
Yes.
And right. So she desperately wants her.
Yeah.
Toy,
Well,
right?
You
her
clarified
giraffe.
for me. It was something about the history that I just didn't know. I didn't have that history to make that interpretation. Maybe I had a bad cold. When I looked up and saw the giraffe, the first thing that came in my mind was stretches his neck a lot, right? Is he one of those animals that really stretches his neck? And then creativity, is that something you have to do sometimes?
That's
You
a
have
good
to
collection.
really stretch your neck. And sometimes if your creativity is linked with social changes, your neck can get bruised. So I was a little bit off, but I'm glad you clarified.
No, that's
for
great.
me.
What a great metaphor.
Yeah, and thank you for the presentation. It has been very therapeutic for me. I was almost in tears looking at the giraffe because it gave me insight. I've been involved in a project for about 30 years. It gave me insight as to how I feel sometimes when I'm in the process of trying to complete my presentation or my project. I do get damaged sometimes. And I think my neck is always out there, and I'm at risk in trying to develop, to create a model for changes on some very deep social issues. So it was very therapeutic for me, and I really thank you for the presentation, and the play was really on target for me, just very on target. So thank you very much.
Can I just make a comment on how astute that metaphor was? By the way, metaphorical thinking is also very important in creativity. But the idea of the giraffe and having to stick your neck out, when you're being creative, isn't that just what you have to do? You have to go where people haven't gone before, and that very often will garner criticism from other people. But if you don't stick your neck out there and take that risk, your creativity and your creative acts will never be out there either. So thank you for that metaphor.
I would just like to question the concept of gratitude. Does it come into play in your thinking a lot? Gratitude. Why would you create? Would it be out of gratitude? Gratitude means that in order to practice gratitude, you have to feel that you're in debt to the other person, right? So for me to create, I'm really trying to pay off a debt to the culture. And it comes out in terms of the concept of gratitude. And I'm 74 years old, and it took me 74 years to get to that concept as the main core of my behavior.
Thank you. Do you want to address gratitude, Dr. Groden, as a part of resilience?
I think I'll leave it for the words spoken.
Very good.
At the end of the little part of the play that you did, the girl comes back in the room with the giraffe sitting in front of her nose and says, I'm forgetting something and I can't remember what it is and I can't see it. And it's, oh well, and she leaves. Is that a creative act there she's engaging in, of creating this little drama of sort of creating a sense of order on a very localized level in this pattern of complete disorder? I mean, is that basically her creative act in this?
Well, that's interesting. Because it's kind of a ritual, isn't it? I mean, ritual seems like form is essential to any kind of creativity. It can't just be all about sticking your neck out. In order to be creative, in order to create a work of art, one has to take form and give a container, a shape to chaos, right? So that's one of the things that ritual is, and ritual is so key to art making. So yeah, the girl coming in and saying, I choose to forget you so I can embrace this other thing, this other choice, the taking of the opera. Yeah, that makes sense to me. That she would need to come back into the room and do that rather than just leave. How many times do we perform magical acts, all of us, in order to make something okay? Even those of us who think of ourselves as rational beings.
Okay, one final question before we wrap up. Does anyone else have a comment or question from the audience? Very well. What advice would you give to our audience on how they could use creativity to deal with stress, cope with stress in their own lives? And Deborah, I'd like to start with you.
Well, I think we've covered so many things tonight. I feel like it would almost be presumptuous for me to give advice. I guess I feel speechless all of a sudden, which is unusual for me. I think engage, just engage. Storytelling is the first thing that jumps to my mind, and I think that we all, probably each one of us, can think of ways in which restorying our lives could be a very useful activity for us, and whatever form that takes, whether it's spoken story or drawn or created as music. I think that's perhaps a good way to begin.
Very good. Eula?
I might finish maybe with African legend. This is the story of a man that has a magic monkey. Okay, you have to imagine you're in the jungle, and you have this magical monkey, and the magical monkey does whatever the man wants. So the man is very happy, and the first thing he's going to ask to the monkey is to clean his house. So the monkey is cleaning his house. But I forgot something very important. He can ask whatever he wants to the monkey as long as he asks something. Otherwise, the monkey eats him. So he needs to keep on asking things. And the man is very happy with this magical monkey. So the first thing he's asking is, okay, you need to clean my house. So the monkey is cleaning, and then he'll watch him, he'll look at him and say, okay, now master, what should I do? Because if I don't do anything, I'm gonna eat you. So, well, the man is thinking, okay, now you have to just do the dishes. And the monkey is doing the dishes, and then stop and then say, I've cleaned out, everything is clean, now what should I do? Because if you don't find any activity, I'm gonna eat you. So the man is thinking, okay, now why don't you just do the garden? And the garden, and so on. And at one point, the man doesn't find anything else to give to the monkey. So the monkey is saying, okay, if you don't give me anything to do, I'm gonna eat you. And so the man is thinking and tell the monkey, you're not gonna go up to the ceiling, and then when you get to the ceiling, you go back to the bottom of the room, and so on like this, forever. And the monkey is doing this and this and this. And the metaphor is that the monkey is our brain. Doesn't stop thinking and thinking. And of course, the main thought that we have is that we are mortal. We are all mortal. We know that death exists. And we need to find something to think about something else. And this creativity is a way for human to think about something else than death, to go even beyond death, to give a meaning to life. And my only advice would be to always think that in creativity there is a big dimension of game, to play. And really, human beings invented games to think about something else. The divertere in Latin. It's to find another way, to even trick the death, because you don't think about this. And when you're not afraid, when you're not stressed, stress is only the power of death coming back and being like, oh my God, I cannot handle it, I'm gonna die. No, it's just by playing, and you're doing a trick to this stress, and you can just go on and create with this creativity something else that looks more yourself than something that would recall death.
Thank you.
I would just recommend that people seek, find, and if need be, create safe space to be creative and have the courage to expand one's horizon. I think that what we need to do is to try on different personas, different perspectives, and see things anew. And that's done through the ability to be safe and be able to explore.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you, Dr. Michael Grodin. Thank you, Deborah Wise. And thank you, Eula Jesus. You've been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum recorded in April 2012, co-sponsored by the First Parish of Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this forum entitled Creativity and Stress, or for additional information about our ongoing radio series and our forum network webcasts, visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Shelley Carson. Thank you for joining us.